Today we're going to be digging into the topic of Protestantism and left and right hemisphere brain differences, okay? We're obviously going to be relying heavily on Iain McGilchrist. We've been looking at quite a bit of his content, and I've been using it especially to talk about how we can do apologetics between Christians and atheists. I think his research into the left and right hemisphere differences in the brain is very valuable for that conversation. But I couldn't overlook the fact he has a chapter where he talks about Protestantism and he critiques it. And woe is me if I just utilize his material to support things that I like. But instead, I want to deal with some of his critiques. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to listen to not the full section. The full section where he talks about the Protestant Reformation is like 50 minutes long. And then if you inserted my commentary, it would be way too long. Instead, I listened through and I highlighted some of the most representative paragraphs. And we're going to listen to those. And then I'm going to interact with them. Okay, so first, if you're new to this, I am going to summarize some of the differences between the left and right hemisphere. Here is McGilchrist's contention. He thinks that certain societies oftentimes have one emphasis on one hemisphere of the brain over against the other. He says good societies have a good balance of the two, a good balance of the left and right hemisphere. But some societies end up leaning too far in one direction or the other. It's like the culture at large begins to take on some of the pathologies that individual aspects or hemispheres of the brain take. His critique is that in our current day and age, we are far too left hemisphere in our orientation, okay? In our current context of focusing on scientism, rationality, etc., we are far too left hemisphere dominant, and he thinks that we should lean back into the right hemisphere. We should embrace more of the right hemisphere. And that is essentially the critique of his book. That as a society, as a culture at large, we need to lean back into the right hemisphere. So what are the differences between the hemispheres? Let me just read a couple of quotes for you. In one chapter, he says this: these are the essential differences. The right hemisphere pays attention to the other, okay? Rather than focusing on the self, it pays attention to the other. Everything that exists for the right hemisphere exists apart from ourselves, okay? And we see things with the right hemisphere in relationship to other things. He uses this phrase called betweenness. The right hemisphere likes the betweenness between things. Consequently, the right hemisphere is also concerned with content. The right hemisphere is also concerned with context, the wholeness of something, okay? Seeing something as a unified, all-inclusive whole, rather than delineated, small segmented parts, okay? That's the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere pays attention to the virtual world that it has created. The left hemisphere is really good at creating systems, boxes, ideas, etc., in which it can insert concepts and then it can pull on them willy-nilly. The left hemisphere loves its little virtual world that it has created. It doesn't like things that are new. The left hemisphere likes things that are old, whereas the right hemisphere likes things that are new. Now, this self-consistent and self-contained system that the left hemisphere creates is very powerful because it helps you to analyze and dig into details of certain things. But it also disconnects you from the other. It disconnects you from the relationships with others because it's isolated. So it is very powerful, but it is only able to know and operate on itself. That's the left hemisphere. Hence, its association with science and rationality. Okay, so that is one set of distinctions you can use to distinguish the hemisphere differences. Let me talk about another one. This is a direct quote from what he said in another chapter a little bit later. He says, the world of the left hemisphere, dependent on the denotative language and abstraction, yields clarity and power to manipulate things that are known, fixed, static, isolated, decontextualized, explicit, disembodied, general in nature, but ultimately lifeless. Okay? That's the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is very powerful to manipulate all of these ideas. The right hemisphere, in contrast, yields a world of individual, changing, evolving, interconnected, implicit, incarnate living beings in the context of the lived world, but in the nature of things, never fully graspable, always imperfectly known, and to this world exists in a relationship of care. All right, that's the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is comfortable with nuance. The right hemisphere is comfortable with ambiguity. The right hemisphere is comfortable using a both-and statement rather than an either-or statement. The left hemisphere prefers either-or statements. The left hemisphere prefers fixed, delineated categories with which it can supply the exact and the correct answer. Okay? So those are a summary of the differences between the left and right hemispheres. And I want you to know that he essentially thinks that society and culture is too far left hemisphere, and that Protestantism is also too far left hemisphere. That's his contention. And we're going to go through some of his critiques in this. He essentially believes this: left hemisphere dominance was promulgated through Enlightenment rationality with which Protestantism was intimately tied. Enlightenment and rationality and Protestantism were tied up, bound together, and kind of moved forward in culture and society in that way. And as such, Protestantism to this day demonstrates a left hemisphere bias that is dangerous for religion, Christianity, and the world as a whole. That's his contention, okay? Now, two more things. He's going to hit us where it hurts, guys. I want everyone to do their best to listen objectively and try to learn from the situation. One of the fundamentals of this channel, guys, is that I love to interact with ideas that differ from my own. I want to have a better understanding. I want to gain wisdom, and that partially comes through trying to objectively interact with people who believe differently than you. The second thing I want to say, guys, is this is going to be pretty heavy stuff, so please stay focused, okay? He's implementing a lot of philosophical ideas, and look, I'm throwing you 19 hours into the book. Let's free fall 19 hours into the book. You don't have the benefit of having had listened to 19 hours of his argument, okay? I tried to summarize in a couple minutes his argument. You don't have the benefit of listening to the whole book. So please recognize it's going to be kind of heavy, and we're going to do our best to jump in. So first, I want to just focus on his summary of the problems. I'm going to start with that, and that's going to start at 1102, and then we're going to go through 1311. And I just want you to hear the summaries of the problems, and we're going to go ahead and comment on that after the fact, okay?
What I wish to emphasize is the transition within the Reformation from what are initially the concerns of the right hemisphere to those of the left hemisphere. How a call for authenticity and a reaction against the undoubtedly empty and corrupt nature of some practices of the medieval Roman Catholic Church. An attempt, therefore, to return from a form of representation to the true presence of religious feeling turned rapidly into a further entrenchment of inauthenticity. Of course, the Reformation was not a unitary phenomenon. The Elizabethan settlement was very different from anything in Calvin's Geneva, and that too differed from the circumstances and beliefs of the Puritans who set sail for New England. But there are often common elements, and when we see them we are, in my view, witnessing the slide into the territory of the left hemisphere. These include the preference for what is clear and certain over what is ambiguous or undecided, the preference for what is single, fixed, static, and systematized over what is multiple, fluid, moving, and contingent, the emphasis on the word over the image, on literal meaning in language over metaphorical meaning, and the tendency for language to refer to other written texts or explicit meanings, rather than, through the cracks in language, if one can put it that way, to something other beyond. The tendency towards abstraction, coupled with a downgrading of the realm of the physical, a concern with representation rather than with presentation. In its more puritanical elements, an attack on music, the deliberate attempt to do away with the past, and the contextually modulated implicit wisdom of a tradition, replacing it with a new rational, explicit, but fundamentally secular order, and an attack on the sacred that was vehement in the extreme and involved repeated and violent acts of desecration. In essence, the cardinal tenet of Christianity, the Word is made flesh, becomes reversed, and the flesh is made Word.
Okay, there you go. That's his summary of, that's the end of the chapter. Okay, now I'm going to back into some of his arguments where he gets all of those ideas from. But that is a summary of all of his attacks against it. Okay? And that final one, Word made flesh, reversed into flesh made Word. Now, I want you guys to know that Iain McGilchrist is no theologian, okay? He doesn't claim to be. He is trying to read the Protestant Reformation as a psychologist, as, a philosopher, and he is just seeing some common themes. So behind many of his criticisms here, I immediately begin to think of arguments for, yeah, this is why we do that, though. Yeah, this is why we do that, though. Okay? But I want you to hear what he's saying for what he is saying. Okay? I want you to take it in and think about it from his perspective. Remember at the beginning how I described the left hemisphere versus the right hemisphere, how they interact with each other. And his point is that a lot of the core emphases of the Protestant Reformation reflect left hemisphere bias. His concern being that Protestant traditions have jettisoned the right hemisphere and are therefore missing at least a significant portion of what the Christian religion is supposed to be about. Okay? So, he talked about the focus on authenticity. Okay? Luther wanted to get rid of the corruption that was going on in the Roman Catholic Church. And so because of that, his intention was to return to a more right hemisphere authentic way of thinking, rather than categorized, split out, and compartmentalized way of thinking that seemed to occupy Roman Catholicism at the time. But he quickly found the tides of his movement reversing against him. And we're going to talk about this in the future. Now, he says there is now a tendency to focus on the clear and the certain. That's a left hemisphere idea. We focus on what's clear and certain. We don't like ambiguity, right? And I do think that's a Protestant ideal. Oftentimes when it comes to especially Orthodox traditions are very ambiguous, okay? Now, we can often fight with Roman Catholics with the left hemisphere. That seems to work okay. But when it comes to Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, etc., man, we struggle to communicate with them. Because a lot of it is ambiguous, a lot of it isn't super clear, it's not explicit, right? And he says, we want what's clear and certain. I do think that's a Protestant emphasis, okay? Also, we have an emphasis on what is single and fixed, static and systematized. I mean, it's no wonder that systematic theology flourished under Protestantism. If I just typed systematic theology into my Logos library, almost all of these are written by Protestants, guys. Almost every single one of these books, systematic theologies, are written by Protestants. We love to systematize and put it in order and put it in categories. That's a left hemisphere bias, okay? The exaltation of the word over image. We're going to get into this a little bit more in the future, but again, we love the word, right? Huge emphasis in Protestantism. That's a left hemisphere bias, okay? The literal meaning of the text over metaphor. Right? The right hemisphere loves metaphor, it loves story and narrative, it loves simile, etc. Literal meaning of the text, that's a very left hemisphere idea. I can't help but think when we talk about hermeneutics in Protestant traditions, we love to talk about the literal interpretation of the text, the literal meaning, okay? The left hemisphere loves to refer to the explicit. We point to other texts to try and bolster up our current argument. We're breaking it down into logical, syntactical categories that we can systematize and use to prop up our theology and doctrine, rather than what he called the cracks in language that reveal the hidden meaning behind these sorts of things. Okay? Very left hemisphere ideal, and it's tied to Protestantism. We abstract things in Protestantism. I have constantly criticized that in Protestantism we make so many of our core fundamental beliefs to be abstract ideas. Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved. Yeah, but how, right? That's so abstract. Much of our language is very abstract. Justification, regeneration, ordo salutis. We are constantly using abstract language to describe concepts and ideas. It's a very Protestant concept, and it's a left hemisphere ideal. The attack on music. You had this movement away from a lot of different varied styles of music and towards this focus on, in many churches, hymn singing only, right? Not accompanied by any instruments. The right hemisphere loves music, guys. And so he's saying, look, the attack on music demonstrates a left hemisphere bias. Now, again, I can understand the theological reasons for why this was done, okay? I can pick that up, but when you jettison music in certain ways, you are losing some of the right hemisphere. He said, doing away with the past. How often do Orthodox and Roman Catholic traditions appeal to early church fathers and Protestants almost never do, okay? Rational but explicit attack on the sacred, right? We got rid of all the grand cathedrals, the stained glass, all of those right hemisphere images and pictures, and we worship in a shopping mall and we're proud of it, right? And his final statement, the word made flesh has reversed into the flesh made word. Very interesting. And again, this is a direct attack on the Protestant conception of sola scriptura, where we so focus on the scriptures, the written word, the Bible. Okay? So, these are all sorts of, it's a summary of a lot of the attacks he's leveling, and I just want you to think of what he's saying and ask yourself, okay, do we fall victim or prey to some of these things? I think that there's some truth to what he's saying. I can see why certain things happen, and I do think some of these things have reversed. Yes, in puritanical traditions, there was an attack on music, but I think current Protestant denominations are returning to music. So I think we're reincorporating some of this stuff, right? I think we are moving away from, for example, an overemphasis on just the Eucharist, for example, the Lord's Supper being a mere memorial, and many churches nowadays, Protestant churches, are talking about the real presence of Christ. That's a movement back towards the right hemisphere. So this doesn't demonstrate everything, but I can see his point, okay? I can see his point. And so I just wanted to summarize these. We're going to now deal with some of these as we walk through the text itself, okay? So let's now go back to, I've got a bookmark here at 1841-59, and he's going to talk about this transition that happened with Luther. Remember I mentioned at the beginning that Luther hadn't intended this as a consequence of his 95 Theses, but it's what ended up happening.
Here too, as in Luther's case, I would say the original impulse towards authenticity came from the right hemisphere, but quickly became annexed to the agenda of the left hemisphere. Not by revolutionary inversion, but by a slippage of meaning which repays attention.
Okay, I want to stop there because this is important. I know that might sound complex. I'm trying to break it down. Earlier in the book, he talks about how the brain typically works is when it grasps ideas, is you first grasp an idea with the right hemisphere, you then hand the idea off to the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere categorizes it and puts it in a systematic form and then hands it back off to the right hemisphere for representation. Okay? That's the pattern. He talks about this constantly throughout the book. Right, left, right. Okay? Your brain constantly does that. I see something new, right hemisphere engages, I pass it to the left hemisphere, I understand and systematize it, the left hemisphere passes it back to the right hemisphere, and the right hemisphere presents it in the whole. Okay? Right, left, right. That's how your brain typically does almost all these things. Now, what he's saying is Luther's initial impulse to reform the church began in the right hemisphere. He's not saying that Luther was left hemisphere to begin with and he was just out on this crusade, right? His impulse began in the right hemisphere. Guys, we're not being authentic here. The church is corrupt and we need to fix that, okay? But what he is saying is once the right hemisphere passed the idea to the left hemisphere, the left hemisphere held on to it. The left hemisphere categorized it, systematized it, and never gave it back. to the right hemisphere. And that's what led to all of these cultural pathologies of over-intellectualizing with the left hemisphere the Protestant and Christian faith, okay? How this right, left, right handoff typically goes, he uses an illustration of music. I think the music illustration helps to understand the best. You hear a piece of music, a new piece of music to you. You're drawn in, you're captivated. You're not delineating out all of the notes yet. You are just grasped by the music, right? Your right hemisphere is taking in the whole, okay? It's receiving all of the information, and you're like, ooh, wow, that's very interesting. Okay, I like that beat. I like those lyrics. What's going on here? Then, once you've grasped the piece of music in its whole, you hand it off to the left hemisphere. Okay, how many BPMs is it? What are the lyrics? Okay, how do you sing it in the right time? What key is it in? And you start to dissect it. That's what the left hemisphere does. You're learning to play it now. But the left hemisphere can only play in a very mechanical fashion because it doesn't take on context, nuance, or anything like that. The right hemisphere doesn't like any, or the left hemisphere doesn't like any of those things. Doesn't like context, doesn't like nuance, etc. Everything's in a fixed category and I can account for it. So you begin to learn to play the music, but you do so in a very mechanical fashion. Once you have the mechanics down correctly, you now hand the music back off to the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere now, in a sense, forgets what it learned. It didn't, but it can truly incorporate it now into a whole piece. Now you can play the music effortlessly with passion because it's in the right hemisphere. And you've got the subtlety between the notes and the keys. You've got the right pause. You've got the right rhythm. Your whole body is caught up in the act of playing the music because you handed it back off to the right hemisphere. Right, left, right. Think about it in learning a new skill. Okay, you're learning to snowboard. It's new to you, so the right hemisphere is trying to take it in. And at first you perceive it as a whole act, right? You're okay, I've got to keep my uphill edge against the snow. I don't want to catch the downhill edge, otherwise I'll fall. I've got to maintain the right body rhythm and balance. I've got to learn how to carve, all that type. You're perceiving it as a whole. Then you break it down in pieces and parts. Okay, I'm just going to learn to go down on the board sideways and just keep the right edge. Now I'm going to learn to turn, and you practice turning. Now I'm going to learn to ride switch. Now, and you begin to break down the activity of snowboarding into small pieces and parts, and you learn individual pieces and parts in isolation. Then when you're skilled, you hand it back off to the right hemisphere. Now you can go down to the mountain and you're not even actively thinking about it anymore. You're caught up and lost in the activity of snowboarding. You're relying on all of those skills. The left hemisphere helped you to do that, but now that you know all of that stuff, you have inherred it into your person, and now you can just act it out, okay? And you can do so with rhythm and grace. This is how human beings learn, function, etc. And here's his point. The right hemisphere grasped something. Luther said, we're not being authentic in the church anymore. I'm going to hand this off to the left hemisphere. We're going to figure out what the problems are, why we're being inauthentic, and then we'll hand it back off to the right hemisphere. Why are we being inauthentic? We're selling indulgences, and we've got rampant, sin in the church, on and on. So he systematizes the whole thing. But it's almost like it never got handed back off to the right hemisphere. That's the idea. Okay, let's go on now to 42:17 through 43:59. He's going to talk about this either or versus both and dynamic.
Luther perceived that the inner and outer realms, however one expresses it, the realm of the mind-soul and that of the body, the realm of the invisible and the visible, needed to be as one. Otherwise, the outward show had nothing to say about the inward condition. In other words, the visible world should be a presentation in the literal sense, that something becomes present to us in all its actuality as delivered by the right hemisphere. This perception, which is simply part of and entirely continuous with the Renaissance insistence on the seamlessness of the incarnate world, inspired Luther to decry the emptiness that results when the outer and inner worlds are divorced. But his followers took it to mean that the outer world was in itself empty.
So what he's essentially saying, do what you say what you do, right? He wants consistency. That's all he wants. That's a right hemisphere idea. I want wholeness. okay? I want wholeness here. But he's saying that it started to go off the rails with some of Luther's followers. Listen to what he says.
And that therefore the only authenticity lay in the inner world alone. The result of this is that the outer world becomes seen as merely a show, a representation of something elsewhere and nowhere, not an image, since an image is a living fusion of the inner and outer, but a mere signifier as delivered by the left hemisphere.
So what he's saying is the outward acts, all of the ritual, pomp, and circumstance of it, began to be seen as inauthentic itself. Luther wanted to integrate the two and bring them together. That's a right hemisphere idea. But the left hemisphere idea basically said, no, it's all internal. The outward ritual, pomp, and circumstance doesn't matter. You need to get your soul saved inside of you. That has to do with the inward man. This has nothing to do with outward show. So stop worrying about that. And once we excise that, we begin to have this overemphasis on the left hemisphere tendencies.
The transition that is made in this important derailment of Luther's intention is not from belief in outer forms to belief in inner forms, but from a view of outer and inner as essentially fused aspects of one and the same thing to the belief that they are separate, either/or. Thus, it should not be thought that the impetus of the Renaissance was abruptly derailed by a contrary movement of the spirit of the Reformation.
What he's saying is the Reformation came right out of the Renaissance, and there's kind of this weird question of why on earth did the Reformation coming out of the Renaissance that really incorporated both hemispheres quite well, why did it tend towards this? And he's saying this transition happened in history because we started to see a dichotomy between the two. And this was just kind of a natural transition that these worldview movements take as we begin to interact with the world.
There was a seamless transition from one position into its opposite. The one morphed into the other. I shall have more to say about such process, not from belief.
Okay, we'll stop there. Seamless transition, the one morphed into the other, and now we ended up in a situation where we are presenting essentially an either-or perspective, right? And what Protestantism with an either-or mindset is saying, not the outward, not the ritual, not the show, not the pomp, not the circumstance, not the stained glass windows, not the cathedral, but the inward man. That's what matters. Get your soul saved, get right with God, be regenerated, repent of your sins and believe. Let's focus on what we need to do inwardly. And that bifurcation, rather than uniting the two ideas, that bifurcation eventually led to a stronger emphasis on the left hemisphere, which ended up being a little bit biased at that point. Okay, so that's his focus. Now I want to turn our attention to his focus on iconoclasm. Okay, and what this is essentially getting rid of images, tearing down images, statues, all of that type of thing.
The Reformation is the first great expression of the search for certainty in modern times. As Schleiermacher put it, the Reformation and the Enlightenment have this in common, that everything mysterious and marvelous is proscribed. Imagination is not to be filled with what are now thought of as airy images. In their search for the one truth, both movements attempted to do away with the visual image, the vehicle par excellence of the right hemisphere, particularly in its mythical and metaphoric function, in favor of the word, the stronghold of the left hemisphere in pursuit of unambiguous certainty. This was not, of course, the first time that iconoclasm had reared its head.
Okay, let's stop there. So, the Reformation gets going, left hemisphere dominance, left hemisphere emphasis, and it wants to do away with the outward pictures and all of those things and focus instead on the word. Now, this is very interesting from a hemisphere perspective. You don't have the benefit of having listened to the rest of the book, but he talks about how all of your language is housed in the left hemisphere. All of your language is in the left hemisphere. And so the left hemisphere loves words, pictures, images, metaphor, art, all of that type of stuff is how the right hemisphere communicates. The right hemisphere is literally mute. It can't talk. It can't use language. It can't use words. Okay? The right hemisphere can't do that. Whenever the right hemisphere perceives something and wants to express it, it goes through the corpus callosum and communicates to the left hemisphere, says, hey, this is what I want to say, and then the left hemisphere gives the language back so it can be communicated, right? Without the left hemisphere, words can't communicate. So when the right hemisphere wants to communicate itself, it uses pictures, images, etc. And his point here is Protestantism went on a tear trying to get rid of icons, pictures, images, etc. And in doing so, it was destroying the very language that the right hemisphere uses. It was getting rid of the right hemisphere's means of communication and basically saying you must communicate on left hemisphere terms. Okay? Very interesting idea that he's pointing out here. And again, obviously there's an emphasis on the word. Okay? We have an emphasis on the word in Protestant traditions. So I can see his point. All right? Let's continue. Again, guys, I know this might be uncomfortable, and I'm a Protestant, right? I'm trying to take things as objectively as I can. I have a different conclusion when we kind of talk about this towards the end. And I think there's a benefit to some of the discussion here, but I know it can be a little bit uncomfortable to consider these things, but I want you guys to know I think this is healthy for us to try and look at ourselves. Okay, do we have flaws, in our tradition, right?
What is so compelling here is that the motive force behind the Reformation was the urge to regain authenticity, with which one can only be profoundly sympathetic. The path it soon took was that of the destruction of all means whereby the authentic could have been recaptured.
So listen, the Protestant Reformation began with, let's regain some authenticity, and then let's destroy all of the means through which authenticity comes, i.e. right hemisphere language, right? That's what he's saying. Whether you agree with him or not, that's what he's saying.
Here I take Joseph Kerner's recent magisterial treatment of Reformation theology, politics, and philosophy through their relationship with the visual image, with symbolism, and with the written word as a major source. There is no comparable work that so intelligently links these different aspects of Reformation culture. The problem of the Reformation was, according to Kerner, one of either-or, a hatred based on the absolute distinction between truth and falsehood. Because of the inability to accept the ambiguous or metaphorical, and because of a fear of the power of the imagination, images were objects of terror. Statues had to be reduced to mere wood. In fact, the supposed idolaters never had believed they were worshipping statues, that self-serving fiction existed only in the minds of the iconoclasts, who could not understand that divinity could not find its place between one thing, the statue, and another, the beholder, rather than having to reside fixed in the thing itself. Luther himself said as much. I believe that there is no person, or certainly very few, who does not understand that the crucifix that stands over there is not my God, for my God is in heaven, but rather only a sign. Decapitation of statues by the Reformers took place because of the confounding of the animate and the inanimate, and the impossibility of seeing that one can live in the other metaphorically. In a world where metaphoric understanding is lost, we are reduced to either-or, as Kerner says. Either the statue is God, or it is a thing. Since it is obviously not God, it must be a thing, and therefore mere wood, in which case it has no place in worship. To see that mere wood can partake of the divine requires seeing it as a metaphor, and being able to see that precisely because it is a metaphor rather than a representation, it is itself divine. It is not just something non-divine representing the divine, it is something divine.
Okay, so you can see he's talking about the iconoclasm that happens, where we've got to get rid of all these images, these statues, because for Protestants, these are Second Commandment violations, right? Pretty clear as day, do not make any graven images. And, the churches were full of graven images. Now, he attributes this reticence to having graven images, icons, carvings, etc., to a left hemisphere dominance. Things for the left hemisphere are either or, they can't be both and. Okay, that's true. And the right hemisphere likes betweenness and metaphors, whereas the left hemisphere likes fixed, rigid categories. So he interprets this iconoclasm as, the left hemisphere sees this either or, either it's a thing or it's divine, and it interprets that situation as, because it's a thing and it's not divine, we should get rid of it, right? But I don't think he does justice to the Second Commandment concerns here, that many Protestants had. Now, those very concerns might be themselves derived from a hermeneutic that relies upon the left hemisphere. I'm willing to grant that. But that's not the case he's making. He's just making the case, look, they were left hemisphere over dominant, everything's either or, they can't see the betweenness, they can't see metaphors, they only see things as this or that, and so what did they do? They blew them all up. They tore them down. Okay? Yeah, I just don't think he does justice to the theological conversation that was happening at the time and the questions about the second commandment. Okay? I don't think he does justice there. But I can see his point, and I can see how from his perspective, remember he's not a trained theologian, I can see how from his perspective he would come to this conclusion. Okay? So I think that's very relevant to the discussion. Okay, let's go on now to another application of this idea. This gets very interesting. He's going to apply this concept of the either or versus the both and to transubstantiation.
This is the difference between the belief that the bread and wine represent the body and blood of Christ, and the belief that they are, in some important sense, the body and blood of Christ, metaphors of it. It was the explicit analytical left hemisphere attempt to untangle this that had led in medieval scholastic theology to an either-or and resulted in the improbable doctrine of transubstantiation, that at the moment of the priests pronouncing the words of consecration, what had been mere bread and mere wine became suddenly and literally the body and blood of Christ. What the right hemisphere had understood intuitively, being comfortable with metaphoric meaning, was forced into the straitjacket of legalistic thinking and forced to be either literal bread and wine or literal body and blood. At the Reformation, this problem re-emerged. To say it was not literally body and blood seemed to Catholic thinking to sell out to the view that it was just a representation, which clearly is inadequate to the reality of metaphoric thinking, in which the body and blood come about not just because of a few words spoken at a specific moment, but because the entire context of the Mass, including all its words and procedures, the presence and faithful disposition of the congregation, etc. It is contexts and the disposition of the mind of those who partake in them, another pair of right hemisphere entities which enable metaphors to work.
Okay, there you go. There you go. And I actually think he's onto something with this one. I've always wondered why there were so many battles over the Lord's Supper in the early church and the subsequent Reformation. And even Protestants battling with Protestants over this sort of thing. Zwingli, Luther, Calvin, constant fighting back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And if you view this with the left hemisphere emphasis, you can kind of begin to see why, right? That there was a saying, I believe, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but oftentimes when there was a debate about, is it really the body and blood, I heard Luther was in a debate one time, and he just kept repeating over and over and over, this is my body. This is my body. And it was like, that settles it. Jesus said, this is my body, therefore, this is his body. Literally and completely. And there's no arguing with it. I mean, I'm sorry, but that's a profoundly left hemisphere way of viewing things. Profoundly left hemisphere way of viewing things. So I do think he's onto something with this one. With this emphasis on transubstantiation, consubstantiation, all, mere memorial, all that type of stuff. I do think a left hemisphere overemphasis due to Enlightenment rationalism and all that type of stuff was playing a role here. At least it makes a lot more sense to me of all of these arguments over the Lord's Supper. Okay, let's move on now to where he talks about the roles of the hemispheres as an aid.
Images become explicit, understood by reading a kind of key, which demonstrates that the image is thought of simply as an adornment, whose only function is to fix a meaning more readily in the mind, a meaning which could have been better stated literally. This anticipates the Enlightenment view of metaphor as an adornment that shows the writer's skill or entertains or aids flagging attention, rather than as an indispensable part of understanding. Sacrament becomes information transfer, writes Kerner. Its material elements convey not substances but meanings, and these latter are immutably conveyed regardless of the form they take. In the 20th century, too, we have seen liturgical reformers embrace a view that the meaning is independent of the form, one of the most damaging legacies of the Reformation.
Okay, let's stop there. This one's very interesting, guys. And I can see what he's talking about with this tendency. It's a little abstract, but I want you to think of it. Okay, the right hemisphere communicates through metaphor and images. In this way, the right hemisphere is communicating a truth that cannot be communicated with language. Do you hear that? Do you understand that? The contention is there are two separate ways of viewing how metaphors and images impact us. And his contention is that the right hemisphere communicates with metaphor and images in ways that cannot be put into words by the left hemisphere, cannot be put into language by the left hemisphere, is not able to be contained. Okay? If that's the case, then removing those metaphors and images removes something for you. However well you are able to try and communicate the same ideas with the left hemisphere, you lose something. That's his idea. In contrast, the Protestant tradition sees a different role for metaphors and images. Metaphors and images become an aid to help you to communicate words. You have words or ideas, and the idea is let's use an illustration to help drive the point home. Let's use an illustration to help clarify for people. And I'm going to tell you something, guys. Whenever I was trained in preaching and teaching, I took many classes on preaching and teaching. Whenever I was trained in it, illustrations were presented that way. You explain the text with words, then you illustrate the text, then you apply the text. Okay? That second part, illustration, when dealt with by those in my Protestant tradition, almost always said something to the effect of, it is important to illustrate because that will help you to drive home the point to your listeners and motivate them to take action because they can see it in a picture. But notice that illustrations, metaphors, and images have explanatory power from a Protestant perspective. He contends that that is not the point of metaphors and images. Metaphors and images, for McGilchrist, communicate content themselves, independent of words. And they communicate content, furthermore, that cannot be communicated by words. That's a very important distinction. And I think he's right about this, that we as Protestants have thought that metaphors and images are merely explanatory in their function, rather than possessing their own innate quality to communicate something that is wordless. Now, I don't know that I would take that application to mean let's get images back in the church. Okay? I will say I am trying to use more metaphors and illustrations in my sermons recently. And not merely as explanatory tools, but as almost an exegetical point that I just drop in there as well. And sometimes I don't even explain them. Sometimes I drop quotes, illustrations, metaphors, images, and let them be. Okay? So this is an interesting one. And I do think Protestants treat it like he's talking about here. I don't know what our final conclusion ought to be, but I do think Protestants treat it this way. Let's move on now to his discussion of the word, the exaltation and the overemphasis in Protestant traditions on the word. Couple of minutes on this.
Continuing the idea that sacrament has been reduced to information transfer, Kerner continues that the seeming afterthought that Christ's words need explaining completes a scenography of data downloaded from a storage medium. Even the words of sacrament count only if they mean something, for all else serves no purpose. This is the era of the triumph of the written word, and the words actually acquire the status of things. I'm reminded of Sam Johnson's wise admonition that words are the daughters of earth, whereas things are the sons of heaven. In Protestant culture, writes Kerner, words acquired the status of things by their aggressive material inscription. A compendium of consoling sayings consists mostly of sayings about sayings. It is fascinating that the way to get the meaning across is apparently to repeat the words endlessly, drumming it further and further into the realm of the overfamiliar, again the domain of the left hemisphere. For example, the words verbum domini manet in aeternum, the word of the Lord shall endure forever, yet a further element of self-referentiality, became so familiar that it was reduced to the acronym VDMIE. Note that these acronyms start with Roman bureaucracy, example SPQR, and are, I would say, a hallmark of the bureaucratic mind. Look at modern officialdom. The letters VDMIE were embroidered and reproduced endlessly, ultimately becoming, despite the reformers, a totemic apotropaic device, a talisman with the status of an idol as the reified words in their abbreviated form becomes the only available thing for the sacred to attach to. As Kerner puts it, materialized for display, words become objects of ritual action, a point also made by Chris Rettenbeck. The word freezes into an idol.
Okay, let's stop there. Again, Protestant tradition is very emphatic upon the authority of the word. Sola scriptura. I mean, I don't know how many times I've said that phrase in my life. We say it all the time. Tota scriptura. You know, we really focus on the word in Protestant traditions. And there's no doubt that's a left hemisphere idea. That's a left hemisphere emphasis. And for him, he thinks essentially what ends up happening is you can only explain the word by more words. And so you just keep saying words to explain words, right? For him, this is, again, like he said, self-referential. So I can't deny that there's an emphasis on the word in Protestant traditions. I don't know that that's necessarily bad. We're going to talk about things here in a little bit with his final ideas, but there it is. That's his critique. Okay, let's go on now to his final ideas, and then I will just interact with them. They start here in about 20 seconds and are going to go for about a minute and a half.
Observation, the rituals of Catholicism lacking speech, cultivating rather what has to remain imprecise, implicit, but richly metaphorical, became senseless and indecipherable. Image breakers ceaselessly say that images cannot speak. Their failing is their silence. They do not use words. These different ways of looking at the world, proclamation of the word versus manifestation of the divine, are aligned with hemisphere differences. As Ricord demonstrated, the emergence of the word from the numinous is the primordial trait that differentiates proclamation from manifestation. For emergence of the word from the numinous read the triumph of the left hemisphere over the right. At this time, according to Kerner, pictures become art moved out of their living context in worship to an artificial context where they can become allowable and safe. With frames round them, often pictures had literally to be reframed because of the exigencies of smuggling them away from the iconoclasts to safety. Contexts bring meanings from the whole of ourselves and our lives, not just from the explicit theoretical, intellectual structures which are potentially under control. The power-hungry will always aim to substitute explicit for intuitive understanding. Intuitive understanding is not under control, and therefore cannot be trusted by those who wish to manipulate and dominate the way we think. For them, it is vital that such contexts, with their hidden powerful meanings that have accrued through sometimes millennia of experience, are eradicated. In terms of the conflict that forms the subject of this book, the left hemisphere, the locus of will to power, needs to destroy the potential for the right hemisphere to have influence through what is implicit and contextual.
Okay. Let's go ahead and stop there, and I'm going to kind of give my final thoughts now. You can see in that last section, he was talking about the fact that we end up destroying the right hemisphere, the implicit, the metaphors, etc. We systematize all of our theology. Everything has its place, and everything is in its place. This is Protestantism. Protestantism has done this with Christianity. But here is something that I think is important to recognize. I don't think that that is a negative on Christianity in and of itself, okay? And here's where I'm going with this. nearly everywhere that I have seen sola scriptura abandoned, I have seen problems result in terms of the Christian faith and Christian religion. Sola scriptura is the bedrock foundation on which true Christianity, I think, can stand. Now, I recognize what he's saying with a lot of this stuff, and I do think there's a Protestant overemphasis on the left hemisphere. I think we've borne that out through history, and I think that's the case at this moment in time as well. We constantly put things into these fixed categories, and we react this way. So I'm taking his critique in stride, and I think there's something very powerful we can learn from it as Protestants, okay? I believe wholeheartedly that Protestants need to reincorporate the right hemisphere, especially in our postmodern culture. Postmodernism has left a vacuum in its wake. And what people are hungering for in this vacuum is the right hemisphere. And so we have an opportunity as Christians to present profoundly right hemisphere Christianity and religion. Protestantism is ill-equipped for this task, given its history and its emphasis. Okay? I believe all of that's true. But I have also seen Christianity go horribly wrong when sola scriptura has been abandoned. Here is my suggestion. We talked about this in the middle, but I think it applies here more than ever. He always talks about this right, left, right handoff. Okay? You grasp a new idea with the right hemisphere. That was Luther when he kicked off the Protestant Reformation. You hand it off to the left hemisphere for it to be systematized and put into all of its categories and forms. That's what the left hemisphere does, and that's what we have been doing since the Protestant Reformation. Okay? And it's worked well for us. Why? Because we have lived in a culture that has prized the left hemisphere. Scientism and rationality are also grounded in the left hemisphere. Philosophy is also grounded in the left hemisphere. So while the culture was very modern, while the culture was very rational, it made sense for Protestantism, apologetics, all of these things to be built upon left hemisphere ideas. And it held its own. It fared fairly well. Okay? That worked for that time. But in our postmodern culture, we have a vacuum that the left hemisphere can't fill. Postmodernism demonstrated the insufficiency of the left hemisphere alone. It demonstrated that. And it left nihilism in its wake. What we must now do as Protestants is hand off our left hemisphere theology back to the right hemisphere. We don't abandon sola scriptura. We don't abandon all of the foundational theology and the great and rich traditions that we have built over the last several hundred years. We keep them as our firm foundation, but now we must build upon the edifice. And we must build upon the edifice with the right hemisphere, not the left. This is what I truly believe. This is the conviction I think that we need to have as the church in our current society, our current culture, our current day and age today. It is as though for the last several hundred years, Protestant Christianity has been laying a very good foundation. But there are no rooms there. Nobody can live in it. Okay? We need to start building the rooms. How do we do that? We lean back into our right hemisphere. Okay? How can you do this? Well, you can return to a greater and more lofty appreciation of the ordinances, the sacraments, if you will. I'm not talking of returning to transubstantiation or consubstantiation, anything like that. But I do think we need to embrace the physical image, picture that God has given us in order to grow and develop and really have that to be a central part of our worship and our practice. I think we need to embrace music and its ability to communicate rich truths in ways that mere words cannot. That's right hemisphere. I think we need to utilize more pictures, images, metaphors in our preaching and teaching. I think we need to be with people where they're at, understand the context and the relationship of individuals. This is what we need to lean into as Protestants, and I think this is what is going to help us to be effective in our current culture. So, that's my review of Iain McGilchrist's critique of Protestantism. I think he levels a good critique. I am not abandoning Protestantism because, oh man, it's so lacking. Instead, I think Protestantism needs to fulfill or complete the right-left right handoff. Luther started with the right. He handed it off to the left. For the last few hundred years, we've been embracing Protestantism with the left hemisphere, and now we need to hand it back to the right and implement Christianity in a very tangible and real way that is going to have an impact on people's hearts and lives. Okay? So that's my contention. That's my review. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. You can let me know what you think, and I would love to chat about it. But that's where I'm coming from, and that's a lot of the work that I'm doing now is leaning into. Okay? Never abandoning. I love theology. I love doctrine. I love the truths of the faith. I love our Protestant heritage. I love Reformed theology. Never abandoning those things, but building upon that firm foundation. That is my approach and my idea.